The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. I've known for a long time that C.S. Lewis was friends with Dorothy L. Sayers, the author of a wide range of books and essays, including the Lord Peter Wimsey Mysteries, The Mind of the Maker, and The Lost Tools of Learning. But I was never clear on the nature of their friendship. Gina Dalfonzo tells the story of that friendship in her new book, Dorothy and Jack. This is Gina's first book, but she has another book hot on its heels. The Gospel in Dickens releases next month. Gina Dalfonzo, thank you so much for being on the Habit Podcast with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you have written this book, Dorothy and Jack, about Dorothy Sayers and C.S. Lewis and their friendship, their 15-year friendship, right?
Yes.
So I imagine my listeners are very familiar with C.S. Lewis, maybe a little less familiar with Dorothy Sayers. So could you just sort of give a quick overview of who Dorothy Sayers was and why we love her so much?
Sure. Well, she was a very multifaceted author. I mean, you can't pigeonhole her. She wrote a wonderful series of mystery novels and short stories that are right up there with Agatha Christie's. I mean, I would say better than Agatha Christie's. So she was one of the golden age mystery novelists. She also wrote some great theological essays. She was a playwright. She translated Dante, the Divine Comedy. Yeah. So she did a little of everything, wrote a little of everything, and was just a fascinating person and author.
So she was born, Lewis was born in 1898, and she was born about 5 years before that, right?
Right.
And so she lived, so obviously they were contemporaries, and so they're, but not exactly the same age, but close to the same age. And then she, I think, died in the 50s. Is that right?
Yes, I believe it was 1957.
Yeah. Okay. And how did she and Lewis connect?
Well, she became a famous writer before he did. But when Lewis was just starting to get established as a name, she read something that he wrote, and she wrote him a fan letter, which unfortunately we don't have anymore. It appears to have been lost. But we know from things that they said later that she wrote him this fan letter, and it was great. He loved it. She was a wonderful letter writer, as he would later tell her. And so he wrote back, and they got they established this connection. She started to quote him in her writing, and they just really were liking and appreciating what each other had to offer. And from this correspondence, eventually they got to meet in person, and they got to be friends. But because they did live fairly far apart, they did keep writing letters, which is a great boon to us because now we have the letters to read.
Yeah. I remember somebody, I think it was Flannery O'Connor was talking, who was also a great letter writer, of course, but she used the phrase that somebody's, all their good stuff went up in talk, right? Because they were with their friends, all the good stuff went up in talk instead of getting written in letters. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that was Flannery O'Connor. It sounded like something she would say.
Probably, yes.
Yeah. And if don't I remember from your book that Lewis said something like her letter was the first time he got a fan letter from a famous person or something like that?
Right. From a notable name, and so it was a pretty big deal for him. And I wish we had the letter. Right. Unfortunately, we don't. But it meant a lot to him, which is why he wrote back, and things just went from there.
Yeah. Of course, he wrote back even to people that it didn't mean a lot to him, right? I mean, he was a very diligent correspondent.
Yes.
Was she as diligent in her correspondence? Did she answer all her fan letters the way Lewis did?
I don't know if she answered them all. She answered a lot of them. Mm-hmm. I have her collected letters, which are, unfortunately, I think some of the volumes are out of print now, but they are worth, scrounging around on the internet to find because they're great. And there's 4 volumes of them. So she wrote to a lot of people, and a lot of those were responses to fan mail. Or to people who wrote to argue with her, just all that sort of thing. Yeah. Okay. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because everything I know about this relationship I know from your book, and so you would know better than I would here. For C.S. Lewis, what he was most excited about that she wrote were the plays. Remind me what the plays were called. Yes.
The Man Who Would Be King.
The Man Born to Be King. Yes, she actually wrote these plays for radio. It was in the 40s. The war was still going on, if I remember correctly. And she was commissioned to write this series of plays on the life of Christ for BBC Radio. And they were a big hit. She did a wonderful job, and you can read them in book form still. They're available out there. So she had these plays on the radio, and Lewis listened to them, loved them, and would keep reading them over and over again for the rest of his life. They were some favorite Lenten reading of his. He'd read them during Holy Week.
And you make the case that those plays by Sayers possibly influenced the way that C.S. Lewis talked about, portrayed, I guess, Aslan.
It is. I will be upfront and concede that that's speculation on my part, but I think you can make a strong case for it because her depiction of Jesus is, for that day and age, it's a very well fleshed out, well-rounded depiction because there had been a lot of restrictions prior to that on how you portrayed Jesus on stage or on the radio. You had to be extremely careful about how you did it. But the restrictions were lifted a bit. She was able to really make him a fully human person, in addition, of course, to being the Son of God, and she did such a great job. And her Jesus is very strong, very bracing. I think that's a word she used herself, and yet very compassionate. All the things that we know Jesus is, but she really brings this out in her plays, and I think you could argue that Lewis was very influenced by that depiction because his Aslan, the lion who depicts Jesus, who is Jesus. I never know quite how to put that. For
right.
some Lewis aficionado somewhere will
right.
correct me, but we know what I'm saying. And his Aslan has all of those qualities: the sternness, and the love, and the compassion. And I just think that you could hardly read this depiction of Jesus over and over and over again every year and fail to be influenced by it.
Yeah. You say at one point that C.S. Lewis saw in Dorothy Sayers a gift that she didn't see herself. And I think maybe this was with respect to apologetics, maybe.
Yeah. Sayers, it's really fascinating to study her apologetics, her work in that area. You could say she was dragged into it kicking and screaming almost. She was a very strong believer in, as we would put it today, staying in your lane and just doing the thing that you felt called to do. And she didn't particularly feel called to do this, and yet she sort of got pulled into it, and Lewis was right there urging it along because he saw her as a wonderfully lucid and logical explainer of the Christian faith, and he thought, she ought to be out there doing this, and she would sort of fight with him over it, but but she would, and yet she kept doing it. I have a quote here from the book, from one of her letters that I absolutely love, and she's talking to Lewis here about an atheist that she's corresponding with, and she's not enjoying it at all. And she says to Lewis, "You like souls, I don't. God is simply taking advantage of the fact that I can't stand intellectual chaos, and it isn't fair." So, I mean, she was so reluctant about this, and yet she, at the end of the day, she had to acknowledge, God is trying to get me to do something here. And Lewis was right there just sort of, saying, yes, you're good at this. You should do this, even when she, snapped at him, even when she wasn't enjoying it, even when she was like, get me out of this. She kept on going because she recognized God's call. And I think because Lewis was her friend that knew she could do it and thought she should do it.
Yeah. That's so important. I mean, having people in your life who kind of say, as you said, you can do this. It is hard to get enough distance from your own self to see, where your gifts lie sometimes.
Yeah.
And by the way, when she said, you like souls, I don't, surely she was exaggerating, or was that true? She didn't like people.
That's a good question. And there are all kinds of ways that you can take that, but I tend to think she was referring to the whole process of evangelism and winning people over and the rest of it. And there was a lot of that process that she just didn't feel suited for, that she had a hard time with it. And yet, at the same time, when a soul came to Christ, she was glad about it. And later in her life, she became friends with Barbara Reynolds, who would eventually become her biographer. And her writing, Sarah's writing and her work helped Reynolds come to Christ. And when that happened, Sayers was pretty pleased about it, and she ended up standing as Reynolds' godmother when she was baptized. So she could be pretty happy about that. But she could also be, when she was feeling dragged into work she didn't want to do, she could also be kind of flippant and misanthropic about it. So we all have multiple sides and multiple feelings about things.
Yeah, and that whole debate between Sayers and Lewis on this topic, you put in terms of, you use the phrase, they had different ideas with regard to their artistic conscience. What do you mean when you say that about these two artistic consciences?
Sayers had very clear ideas about what that should mean and what it should look like, and she believed that you should do the thing that you felt called to do, and stick to it because she believed that call came from God, and that that God gave you the gift and the ability to do it. And she had a lot of problems with what happens when Christians think, oh, I can talk about that, I can talk about this, I can talk about whatever I want to from the Christian point of view because I'm a Christian, and that naturally equips me to do it. And she had real problems with that. And there is something to be said on her side, because sometimes she talked about bad Christian art, for example. And there's a wonderful quote from one of her letters, which I don't have in front of me, but she talks about how for every person who feels comforted by a piece of bad Christian art or literature or whatever, there are more who are just sickened by it and think, if Christianity can produce something that bad, it must have a lie in its soul. And so she saw a real danger there. I mean, she wasn't just being self-indulgent. She saw harm being done when Christians just produced shoddy work and said it was for the sake of the gospel. Lewis, now you have to take into account that Lewis was good at a lot of things.
That's right. Yeah,
and had a lot of gifts, just like Sayers did herself. And Sayers would complain sometimes that, Lewis is all over the place. He's talking about this subject. He's talking about that subject, which she was not a big fan of that sort of way of working. So Lewis would argue with her that, if you're a Christian and you're a writer and somebody asks you to write on this particular subject, well, you probably ought to just, put aside your artistic conscience and go and do it. And she would argue with him that you can't just do that with everything somebody asks you to do, because you're not always equipped in that area, and you might come up with something that's really bad and really wrong and possibly damaging. So they went back and forth over this, and in a lot of ways, he recognized, he sort of acknowledged that she had a good point. And later on in some of his works, you see him echoing what she said. He would say things like, I quote one of his essays somewhere where he says about Narnia, I didn't just, want to write a useful children's Christian book. I wanted to write a good book for children, and this is the shape it took, and this is the way I had to write it because this is the way it came to me. So he's sort of echoing her, and he's sort of seeing her point. But it's a very complex topic, and there's a lot to go back and forth over with it, and they did that. Yeah.
Yeah. I love the way, that you portray in this book, the way these two friends disagreed. They went at it a good bit, and how much they appreciated the fact that there was somebody in their life that they could, that was thoughtful enough to really disagree with, And of course, Lewis had that. The Inklings were, would really go hammer and tongs at each other a good bit. And I don't know if Sayers had anybody else in her life to do that with or not, but I love the way that, this was our iron sharpening iron. These two people who didn't see everything the same way and yet seemed to love each other. All the more for that disagreement.
Right. Yeah. Sayers had she had as many kinds of friends as she had gifts. So she, like with some of her mysteries, she worked very closely with her friend Muriel St. Claire Byrne, for example. Their friendship went all the way back to their college days.
That sounds like somebody said, make up the most British sounding name you possibly can.
Yes, doesn't it though? Muriel St. Clair Byrne. So she was a close friend who worked with Sayers on some things related to her mysteries. Mm-hmm. And so she had friends that she could do that sort of thing with. Mm-hmm. And she had friends that she worked on other projects with. But as I mentioned somewhere in the book, she didn't have a lot of friends who were directly involved in apologetics. And strangely enough, Lewis didn't either. We tend to think of, Lewis had the inklings and they were all in all to each other, but Tolkien didn't really do apologetics. Mm-hmm. Most of the other men in that group didn't do apologetics. They were just like sort of sharing creative work for the main part. Mm-hmm. So here he was, a creative writer who also did apologetics, and Sayers was sort of in the same boat. And so each of them found them sort of uniquely positioned among their respective friend groups, and that was what made it so nice that they had each other, and they could reach out to each other, and they could run things past each other and sort of maybe bellyache about the difficulties and just really help each other to grow in that respect.
Yeah. By the way, do you know how often they saw each other in person? I mean, I know, a lot of what you did was with their letters, but how often did they actually sit in the same room together?
I don't think it was a lot. We don't have our records may not show like every meeting they had. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of letters saying, I love to see you again. We haven't met in a long time. And then you have a few letters saying, let's meet at this time and place. And then, it was nice seeing you again. All that sort of thing. So we know that they met sometimes, but it wasn't as often as they would have liked. Lewis was very busy in Oxford and then later at Cambridge. Sayers was very busy. Her husband was, he had some illnesses he was dealing with. He became more and more of an invalid over the years. So he needed a lot of care. And besides that, she was very busy, with her own work and her own projects. So they didn't get together very often, but when they did, it sounds like they had a great time.
Yeah. Where did Sayers live?
She was more out in the countryside.
But not London, though.
She wasn't in London. She had friends in London, and she would be there sometimes. Mm-hmm. And she had to travel a bit for work sometimes. But I think she lived in Essex. So
gotcha.
Yeah, it's more countryside.
Yeah. There's that passage in The Four Loves when Lewis is talking about friendship, and he remarks that I think he's talking about, I've got these various friends, and each friend brings something out in another friend that the other friends can't bring out. Yeah. What did Lewis and Sayers bring out in each other that maybe other people other friends didn't bring out?
That's a great question, and I think it actually sort of changed over time as they got to know each other better. They started, theirs was a very intellectual friendship. So they started, on a purely intellectual / theological footing. But as they got to know each other, their personalities sort of came out more. Lewis said her personality was like a high wind, and he loved that. He loved somebody who was just very boisterous and enthusiastic and in love with life and could just like bowl you over. And Sayers was very much that way. And so he had a similar personality. So they could really like let that go with each other. But over time, and it's interesting, you see their friendship grow more personal, and both of them tended to think of, and they would write about friendship as this affair of the mind. Lewis even went so far as to write, you don't have to know all the personal things about your friend. You just, it doesn't matter. You're just like two minds together. And they both liked that sort of friendship. And yet they started to bring out more of the personal and the emotional aspects of each other. When when Lewis married Joy Davidman, and when she was ill and when he was going through all this big emotional upheaval, he wrote to Sayers about it. And, people often quote some of the beautiful things he wrote about Joy. And most of those things he wrote to Sayers. He wrote, my heart is breaking and I've never been so happy before. He wrote all these beautiful things about his marriage, and he told them to this friend of his whom he had known for so many years now. And she was very sympathetic and encouraging. Not a lot of Lewis's friends were really gung-ho about his marriage, but she was very positive and encouraging, and she met Joy and they got on really well. And so he had this friendship supporting him in this, which I think he really needed. And, she was able to tell him some personal things about herself too, some of the things that she had gone through that were hard. And so that this friendship just developed so much over time, and it's really interesting to follow.
He had so few women friends in the first place, it seemed like. At least that's the impression I get from, unless there's friends I don't know about.
Yeah. Well, he did develop some female friendships over time, and he learned a lot from them too. His friend Ruth Pitter, and I think Sister Penelope, I think was the name of the Anglican nun that he got to be friends with. Yeah. And the great thing about these friendships was that Lewis, I mean, he could be a very boisterous and argumentative personality, but he could also be very humble and very willing to listen. And his female friends, including Sayers, would sometimes tell him things about, what it was like to be a woman that he didn't know and had learned from. And he would say to Sayers, what you told me about this, I never thought of it that way before, but yes, you have a good point. And so he would listen, he would absorb, he would learn. And she did a lot for him in that respect. Yeah,
that's neat. Because he went from being a motherless boy to going to all-boy boarding schools to the military to, to being a bachelor.
And Sayers would sometimes, say to her other friends, he has lived in such a male-oriented world, he doesn't get women at all. But and yet she was very patient with him, and she looked at his good side, and she encouraged him to learn, and he was willing to learn, and that's a great thing in a friendship. But when people have things that they have blind spots or blank spots, and your friend is willing to just sort of walk alongside you and help you see things you hadn't seen before. I
want to talk briefly about the distinction that you mentioned between influence and encouragement. And I think you were quoting Diane Glyer, who was a guest earlier on this podcast, when she was I guess the way Tolkien talked about their literary friendship was that it wasn't a matter of influence, but a matter of encouragement. And then Glyer and/or you pointed out that he didn't necessarily say that those were mutually exclusive, right? That encouragement is a kind of influence.
Right. I think it is, because all of these people, Sayers and Lewis, and also Tolkien and the other Inklings, they all had such strong and distinctive personalities and voices. And so, Lewis famously said, you couldn't influence Tolkien, you might as well try to influence a Bandersnatch. and I don't think any of them really saw themselves like rubbing off on each other or anything like that. But encouragement, yes, is a kind of influence, because we've already seen, for instance, how Lewis's encouragement maybe helped Sayers develop her voice in apologetics. And she helped him to become aware of some things that he hadn't been aware of before. And so the presence of somebody who sees your good points and who pushes you to develop yourself more and more, that that really can be a very strong kind of influence.
Yeah. All right. This is a shot in the dark. There may not be a good answer to this question, but I'm asking anyway. Is there a work, is there a Sayers work that you think wouldn't have existed if it weren't for Lewis's influence?
That's a good...
I'm sorry, not influence. Encouragement was the word I meant to use.
Sayers work that wouldn't have.
And then we'll flip-flop it.
That's a really good question. I'm thinking through like her essays and so forth. I don't know about that because as I've already said, she was a very driven writer who sort of knew exactly what she wanted to write and who wrote it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we can say that there was something that wouldn't exist without him. What we can say is that with works that she was working on, he helped her to keep going. Her Dante translation, she had really counted on support from Charles Williams, who died, and so she was without that support. But Lewis really supported and encouraged and praised her in that, and sometimes argued with her translation, but also kept praising and encouraging. And her translation of the Song of Roland, a French poem, he gave her a lot of encouragement and praise with that, and she appreciated it a lot. So, perhaps there were works that I don't even know if I could say that there were works that wouldn't have been finished without him, because she just had so much drive. Yeah. But I do know that there were works that he helped her with that she was very, very appreciative of. Yeah.
So the other way around, are there works that Lewis might not have finished or might not have been as good if it hadn't been for her encouragement?
Well, I think the seed for the book that became Miracles came from her. She said, you really ought to write a book on miracles in so many words. She just said it. And so he wrote back and told her he was working on one. It's not quite clear whether he started working on it because she said that or whether he had already started it. But in any event, he took her encouragement and ran with it. So there is that one.
Good.
That comes to mind first.
Love it. Friendship is such an incredibly powerful creative force. These things we've been talking about are, we talk about, sometimes people talk about literary friendships, and even friendships that aren't specifically literary. I think they're so generative of creativity.
Yeah.
And I love the way you point that out and draw that out in Dorothy and Jack. You told me something right before we started that I didn't know. That is that you've got another book coming out. So this book is coming out in August. We're recording this in July, but by the time this episode airs, that your book will have come out. The Dorothy and Jack will have come out. But tell me about your book that you've got coming out in September.
Well, that is called The Gospel in Dickens, and it's coming out September 22nd from Plough Publishing. And they have this series called The Gospel in Great Writers. So it includes, there's actually, Sayers actually has an entry there, The Gospel in Dorothy L. Sayers. They also have Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, a number of other great writers. And so I got in touch with them and said, because I've had this longstanding interest in Charles Dickens, and I got in touch with them and said, would you like The Gospel in Dickens? And they were very enthusiastic. So yes, that comes out in September. And I hadn't planned for these two books to come out so close together. It just sort of happened. But it's largely made up of some excerpts from his work that just sort of show how he engaged with faith and with the big questions. It's got some commentary and some notes by me. And the foreword is by Karen Swallow Pryor, who I think you're familiar with, who is an amazing writer and scholar, and was so wonderful to take the time to do that for me. So and she's also a big Dickens fan. So she wrote this great foreword, and so it just came about that. I mean, these are my three favorite writers, Sayers, Lewis, and Dickens, and it just sort of came about that I got to publish books about all three of them in the same year.
In a month.
So that was interesting.
Yeah. Okay, here's a question for you. What's so great about Dickens?
Oh, my gosh, where to start? Well, the one thing, a thing I really love about him is just that he loves words, he plays with words, he has fun with words, and we are not always equipped for that in this day and age. A lot of readers say, they struggle because he's so wordy, that they have difficulty. They're like, why does he have to be this way? But if you can just, I think if you could just really try him and get into him, you can often just find yourself getting swept away because, he obviously has like these really great, memorable characters. He has these fantastic convoluted plots, but at bottom, he just has so much fun with words. And I've always loved words. It's always been a thing for me ever since I was little. So I guess I was just in the right mental place when I first discovered him to appreciate that.
There's so much abundance in Dickens, and
that's a great word for it.
Yeah, and I feel like you've sort of got to surrender to it and say, you know what, I'm just like I wouldn't want to assign a Dickens book to a class to read, because when you're in a hurry, it's just frustrating. But when you have time to kind of just surrender to it and say, you know what, wherever you want to go, I'll go.
That's right. You have to just sort of jump on and go along for the ride.
Yeah. And I'm sure you've heard this little formulation before, but somebody, I don't know who it was, said that in the world we live in, there's a bunch of animals and very few giraffes. Mm-hmm. And in Dickens, everybody's a giraffe.
Yeah,
everybody's
well
that
put.
extreme.
That's well put, because he just it was the way he saw the world. He saw these characters and he exaggerated them, and he did all kinds of crazy things with them, and he just made them so interesting and memorable. Yeah. And to tie this back to the other book, both Sayers and Lewis were very fond of Dickens. They enjoyed reading him. Sayers had some critiques of some of his characterizations, but she also just enjoyed him and quotes from him a lot in her own writing. And I believe Lewis did the same.
Yeah. What is when somebody's wanting to get started in Dickens, Dick, you direct them? What's a good place for someone who hasn't read Dickens or hasn't learned to love Dickens? Where's a good Dickens to start?
Well, probably either Great Expectations or A Christmas Carol. Mm-hmm. It helps that they're among the shorter works because some of his novels are very long. And they are just, I think they're probably the easiest to get into in a lot of ways. Sometimes you hear kids in high school say, I was forced to read Great Expectations and I just hated it. Well, I was the opposite. I was made to read Great Expectations in 9th grade and I loved it. So I've always found that hard to relate to. But I think if you're at the point where you feel mentally ready for a little bit of a challenge, you're like, okay, I think I'll try this. And again, if you're willing to jump in and just surrender yourself to the style and the situations and the characters, you can end up with a lifelong love of Dickens. Yeah. Now, if you want to start with one of the great big books, probably David Copperfield is the one to get into, because it's just such a lovely coming of age story. It has things in it that that are timeless, that lots of people can relate to. And you feel for him, you root for him, and you can, I think that's one of the easier ones to sort of get sucked into.
Yeah, I recently listened to that one again. It was one of the first Dickens I read a long time ago, but then I listened to it on audiobook, and I just cried and cried. It was it's such a beautiful book. I just love it. I love Dickens, so I'm glad you're doing that.
Oh, thanks.
And I love Pickwick Papers. That's not one of the more popular ones, but I was recently rereading Pickwick Papers and kept seeing things that had trickled into my own storytelling in the books I've written. And there was this sort of the leaf mold of the mind, as Tolkien said, these things that went in and I didn't even know they were going in there, and then they came out again later.
Yeah.
When I wrote my my swampy fiction stories, I hadn't read. It had been 15 years since I'd read Pickwick Papers, but it was all there somehow. So,
That's remarkable.
All right. So the last question I always end with is, who are the writers who make you want to write, Gina?
Well, I've just named my 3 favorites.
Okay.
So where to go from there? They of course they make me want to write. Somebody else, and this is funny because this is actually a name that came up when we were talking before we started, is Dorothy Parker, who I was telling you I discovered it around the same time as Dorothy L. Sayers in college. And she is so witty and so just so funny, so open, so vulnerable. I mean, we think of her as sort of this woman with a barbed quill in her hand, writing these poison pen types of essays. And she could be very sarcastic and very cutting, but she could also, if she loved something, she could get really gushy about it, which is fun.
That's funny, because what usually gets anthologized is the Barbie stuff, The sweet stuff doesn't make it into the anthologies.
Yeah, but there were lots of sides to her, and she's just very vulnerable, and she can be very open. When I first discovered her in college, I tried writing an essay for a class in imitation of her short piece, The Waltz, which you may remember. I don't remember my essay very well. It was probably terrible, but it was just such fun to try to do that. And I keep coming back to her just as someone who could, she really could put herself out there. That's something that not everybody remembers about her, but she can just say, this. She wrote a lot of reviews, stage reviews and book reviews and so forth. And she could say, this just really affected me personally because of this, or this just, hit my sweet spot, or this made me laugh because of that. And she could put herself into her writing, and yet not in an obnoxious way. That's a difficult trick to learn. You don't want, you do not want to make it all about you. And yet if you can put just enough of yourself in it, you can establish this real bond with your readers that keeps them coming back. So that's a good trick to learn. And I've been trying to learn it for a long time.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because I really do think of her as being sarcastic. Hilarious, but sarcastic and a little mean all the time. And
she
hated Winnie the Pooh, for crying out loud. Who hates Winnie the Pooh? Well, great. Well, Gina, thank you so much. Gina Dalfonzo. I love your book. And there's so many interesting things we didn't get into, because I was trying to sort of stay on the writerly side of things, but so many interesting details about the personal lives of Dorothy L. Sayers and C.S. Lewis. So thank you for writing it, and I hope a lot of people read it.
Thank you so much.
The Rabbit Room has partnered with Lipscomb University to make this podcast possible. Lipscomb has graciously given us access to their recording studio in the Center for Entertainment and Arts building. We're so grateful for their sponsorship, their encouragement, and the good work they do in Nashville. Special shout out as well to Jess Ray for letting us use her song Too Good as part of this podcast. Visit jessraymusic.com to hear more of her beautiful songs.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
This podcast was produced by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. All our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.